Okay, so I'll call the meeting to order. We have on the agenda tonight FY20 preliminary year-end budget to actuals update, fund balance workshop, and the coronavirus relief funds update and discussion. So I'll just go ahead and turn it over to Miranda.
Okay, so I will share my screen. Sorry, I have a different methodology for my screen sharing tonight, so if I look like I'm not looking at the screen, that will change shortly. Bear with me for a minute. Okay, can you see the Finance Committee slide? Okay, perfect.
We can.
Okay. All right, so I just wanted to start off with the FY20 year-end budget results, and as I mentioned in the memo, and there is a comprehensive memo in board docs for anyone who may not have seen it already. As I mentioned in the memo, we're still in the process of being audited, so these results could change, but this is hopefully a pretty good estimate of where we're going to land. I don't think there's going to be too much that would change after this that would be material, but if it does, I'll come back to you and let you know. But so just going to start off with that and then move into kind of a related topic, which is the discussion of our fund balances, and get into a little detail on those that I don't think we really ever have before in the past, at least not recently, since I've been here. So we'll talk about that. And then shift gears and talk about where we're at with the coronavirus relief funds, and discuss strategy and next steps for that.
Greg, yeah, can you promote board member Burke from
Absolutely.
the audience? And then if you want, I can take over managing and you can go do other productive things.
I shall make you co-host.
Awesome.
We good?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, so starting with the budget to actual summary from FY20. So the FY20 budget was $117.4 million. And on the expenditure side of the budget, we're 98.5% expended. That's $115.6 million, with about 1.8 million remaining on the bottom line. And of that 1.8 million, 1.1 million approximately is accounted for in the general fund, 500,000 in food services, and 165,000 in adult ed. On the revenue side, we are 99.1% collected. That's $116.4 million. And of that, 1 million. Sorry, I'm getting confused by my slide. Yeah, so we have $770,000. So we have $1 million uncollected. Sorry, I'm getting totally confused, by the way. I've got my screen set up here. I can't see any of you, and it's like freaking me out. So we're about $1 million short in our revenue collection, but really of that $1 million of apparent shortfall, 770,000 of that is actually budgeted fund balance. So it's not funds that we actually expected to collect. The actual shortfall in expected collections is about 230,000, and that's net of adjustments. And there's a variety of revenue adjustments this year that I'll talk about a little bit more on a future slide. But we had several revenue shortfalls that ultimately we adjusted with expenditure side transactions, so they're not showing up as revenue shortfalls. So it's just a little bit of a weird year, as we all know. So I'll talk about that a little bit later on. But before doing that, I wanted to talk a little bit in more detail about some of the expenditure side surpluses and deficits. So we had, as evidenced by those overall figures on my prior slide, quite a bit left on the expenditure side of the budget, which is always a good thing. The biggest surplus was in salaries and benefits, which is not surprising given that it's our, far and away our biggest expenditure category. We had about $1 million left. That's less than 1% of the salaries and benefits budget. Just, it sounds like a lot, but it's not a huge percentage. And that's consistent with kind of general turnover savings. And by that I'm referring to kind of a variety of things like late hires, vacancies, resignations and rehires, people at, lower salaries potentially, changes in benefits, elections, retirements, et cetera. So additionally, we had a couple of reasons why the budget was a little bit, I don't want to say inflated, but a little higher than necessary. We didn't have the teachers' contract settled at the time of the budget, and the actual increase for FY20 was slightly less than what was budgeted. It was budgeted conservatively. And also there was just an error on the way lane changes are calculated, which resulted in a bit of surplus as well from the beginning. So all of those things combined gave us an end result of about $1 million on the bottom line in salary and benefits. Professional and technical services, we had about 120,000 remaining. That is inclusive of fairly substantial surplus in crossing guards that was a result of obviously closure in the spring. Employee training and development is one of those areas we kind of expected, but didn't know exactly how much we'd have left on the bottom line. Again, it stands to reason that we'd have some surplus there due to closure. Special ed tuition, some placements were discontinued, or students just didn't continue to attend their out-of-district placements. So we ended up with a surplus balance in tuition as well. And, I would note there, and I also noted in the memo, that the actual balance on the bottom line is, I think, a result of COVID pretty explicitly, but we had a sizable deficit last year. So it is noteworthy that we didn't have a deficit again this year as well. So I think without COVID, we probably would have been pretty much spot on. And that is also true in part because we added some ASD in-house services that we otherwise would have had to outplace students for. So I think that the strategy worked out in that regard. Repair and maintenance is another place where we had a surplus. 70,000 or so of this was in transportation. And as I mentioned in the memo, part of that is just there's less when, you don't have to repair buses when you're not using them all spring. So there was some surplus related to that. But we also found, looking back historically, that that budget hasn't been fully utilized in the last couple of years. So we ended up making a $50,000 reduction in that budget for FY21 as part of the cuts that we made at the tail end of the budget process. So that was one area that was reduced. Rentals and leases was underutilized because of the spring athletics season, and supplies really was the one that was most surprising to me. Back when we closed, I think we had really hoped that we would be able to continue to make all of our supplies purchases, stock up some supplies. Obviously we didn't need as much in the way of in-house supplies when we had school closure for 3 or 4 months at the end of the year. But at the end of the day, we just, I think we kept thinking we were going to be able to open up the buildings to receive orders again, and it just took a while. And at the end of the day, we just couldn't get all of the orders placed and received definitively by the end of the year. And in order to use this, FY20 funds, it has to be received by June 30th. And so at the end of the day, we just weren't able to, get all those supplies ordered and received in time. So we had a substantial surplus. I wouldn't read too much into this. The prior year, we did not have anywhere near this type of surplus. So, I think it's largely related to COVID. And again, as I said in the memo, I can't always, in every case here, know exactly what our results would have been if we didn't have, the closure in the spring. So it's not 100%, COVID or not COVID. It's hard to say for sure, but I think this is driven almost primarily by that. Fuel and electricity is another area where it's kind of hard to pinpoint exactly what the COVID-related savings are, but we fully expected that we'd have savings in natural gas and electricity. And we did. And we also had substantial surplus in gasoline, which we believe is in part, certainly there's less gasoline used and we're not using the buses, but it seemed like we had sort of more than we would have expected, even if we had been in school for the rest of the year. So, this was also the first year that we had utilized WEX instead of the city's fuel pumps. So I think, and Javier can correct me if I'm wrong, but are you shaking your head? You're muted.
I don't know that we know, but I think it's interesting because I think we thought that our costs were going to be much higher because we were not fueling from the city, but apparently, and it's hard to tell. So I don't want to.
Yeah, it is hard to tell. I guess my point is like, it is hard to know because it was the first year, but it also, I think we probably were quite conservative because it was the first year. So we reduced the budget. We had about 90,000 left in gasoline. We reduced it by 25,000 for FY21, so didn't want to overdo it, but we did feel like perhaps we had overshot the mark a little bit in gasoline, so had some savings there in FY20 and for FY21. And then food services, food supplies in particular, was another area that we knew we would have some savings, and that savings was anticipated to offset substantial revenue shortfalls, which it did. And I'll talk about that a little bit more in the next slide. So finally, we really didn't have much in the way of deficits. So, we had a fair amount of general surplus. We had a fair amount of COVID-related savings, and we really just didn't have much this year in the way of structural deficits, I think in part to some COVID-related savings, but also just because of a lot of strategic adjustments that had been made in the previous budget year. And so really the only deficits that we saw, well, these aren't even real deficits, to be honest with you. These are, the contracted special ed services deficit that you'll see in the financial summaries is purely because of an accounting adjustment that I had to make to seed, which I've discussed in the past. Is complicated, and I don't need to get into all the details of it. But instead of budgeting it as accounting for it as a revenue reduction, I account for it as an expense. And that enables it to count towards our EPS for funding in the future year. So in FY20, we didn't budget for that type of accounting. We budgeted it as a revenue reduction instead of an expense. In FY21, we adjusted for that, so you won't see that kind of deficit in FY21. And then miscellaneous expenses, the $700,000 deficit you'll see in the financial summaries is pretty much entirely a result of the expense adjustment that I made to basically bail out, for lack of a better term, the food services revenue deficit that we saw. So food services between federal revenue and paid meals had a deficit of about $675,000. And I decided that because I was concerned a bit about food services revenue this year as well, I decided to replenish it because we also had the budget capacity to do so. I decided to replenish their entire deficit as opposed to just bail out what their fund balance hit would have been. So they had quite a bit left on the bottom line of the budget, about 500,000, as I mentioned. I could have done a smaller adjustment and just ensured that they didn't have a negative hit to their fund balance, but instead I decided to kind of keep them whole and replenish the entire deficit, which actually caused them to have an increase to fund balance this year, despite the fact that they had a revenue shortfall. And like I said, I did that in anticipation of potentially another difficult year for them this year. And in order for me to bail them out, by utilizing the general fund, we have to have general fund capacity, budget capacity to do so. And I wasn't sure, what kind of budget capacity we're going to have this year, probably not much. So it just seemed like a good opportunity to ensure that they had a strong fund balance position going into FY21. So, and finally, on the revenue side, the surplus collection we had really was pretty much just, we had some minor things that I didn't call out, but the only real noteworthy one was EPS, which was a result of a bus purchase that we made that we got state approval for that happened after the budget. And so that increased our EPS that we received, which we had expected. And then high cost out of district tuition is a report that's submitted later in the year for some unknown reason to the state. And so sometimes that results in an adjustment to our EPS. And that happened in this past year as well. So that constitutes the $165,000 that we're seeing there. And then, as I mentioned, food services I already discussed. So there was a $675,000 revenue deficit that I basically wiped out by charging the general fund an expense, and that enabled food services to book that as revenue and kind of wipe that balance from their books. And then Maine care reimbursement is confusing as usual, but in reality, the shortfall was about $430,000. That's our Maine care revenue net of seed. And so that was ultimately the shortfall. You're seeing a smaller shortfall on the revenue side because of that expense adjustment that I mentioned previously that shows up in special ed contracted services on the expense side of the budget instead of looking like a revenue deficit. But the real revenue deficit was $430,000. And so as you may recall, and if you read the memo, we expected, obviously we knew that the breathe revenue was an open question, but we felt that the kind of over budgeting of seed was going to cause us to be okay for FY20. And so the original discussion that we had about this back in, February, pretty much held true, or would have held true, except for additional shortfalls that we experienced in Medicaid reimbursement as a result of closure. So Christy, back when we closed, had expected about $300,000 extra in shortfall based on reduction in billable services, and that's pretty much what it turned out. I say that we thought we were going to be okay in FY20. That was already taking into account that we were going to get extra EPS. So we were expecting about 100 offset by our EPS, 100,000 shortfall, I should say, offset by our extra EPS. We thought we'd be okay. We were about 300 worse off than we expected, which is pretty close to what Christy had suggested in the early part of the closure. So that is the really dense, boring part of the presentation. Why don't I stop here for a minute and see if there's any questions on this before we jump into the fund balance discussion.
I don't see any hands raised.
Okay, I'm gonna like swap out my screens a bit because I'm getting irritated by the way I have myself set up. So give me a minute.
Anna, Roberto has his hand up.
Go ahead, Roberto.
Yeah, my internet is slow, so my video is going to be off. I was trying to figure out how to ask the value of identity, because it sounded like a couple of times we weren't entirely sure whether the pandemic was what was driving some of these figures, and I was just wondering, what is the value of identifying how much of it was, pandemic driven, how much of it might have been otherwise, or is that just kind of just like a side note at this point?
I think there's. I'm sorry.
No, I'm sorry. I guess that's it. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, I think that in certain cases I simply can't. Like in utilities, I don't know how to definitively know, because I don't definitively know what the cost would have been if our buildings were open. Because natural gas, electricity, that stuff's all, well, particularly natural gas, affected by the weather. So it's kind of hard to know. And also, prices have changed because of the pandemic. So I think it's more productive in that particular case to project forward and pay attention to it, recognizing that things have changed, and that, you know, it could be indicative that we are actually have more than we need in our budget this year. But I'd rather look at it kind of moving forward, and work closely with facilities on projections there, recognizing it could be a place to watch, rather than trying to figure out exactly, you know, what was pandemic-related savings versus kind of potential actual surplus in the budget.
And I think, can I just interject? I mean, I think that overall you've done a really good job of highlighting the places where, you know, like we know that the food deficit is largely driven by that. I think, you know, we know that the crossing guards is driven by that. We know that some of the rental costs are driven by COVID. So I think for the most part, those large ones, you've got a really solid handle. I think it's sort of the marginal, like what percentage of the maintenance repairs, you know, would have materialized if we actually, you know, if we ran buses in the spring. So I think, but for the most part, the ones that, you know, are sort of in question are sort of on the margins. It's not in the, you know, the thick of those costs. I think the one that's a little fuzzier is the Maine care reimbursement. But even there, I feel like it's fairly well defined as to what we knew was going to be the deficit and what the delta is. And the delta is probably driven by the fact that we weren't able to bill for students during the closure at the same rate that we were billing for them, you know, prior to the closure. So.
Yeah. Emily has her hand.
I'm sorry. I was just going to say that was really helpful. So just saying, appreciate the response there. Thank you.
Go ahead, Emily.
I apologize for this question. I'm looking at the memo as well, but I am slightly confused by the food supplies. And Miranda, I apologize. I know you described this in quite some detail, but I can't totally get my head around it. So the thing that is confusing to me is that there is, you're not still on that slide, but you say that food supplies was underspent by $370,000.
We didn't serve as many meals, so therefore we didn't use, you know, it didn't cost us as much money to produce the meals. And then we obviously didn't serve as many meals and therefore didn't get reimbursed for those meals. And so I think that that's, you know, the way to sort of think about that is, you know, if we had sort of prepared all the meals and then didn't get reimbursed for them, we would have had a larger deficit than what we wound up having, because that deficit, we never incurred that deficit because we didn't prepare the meals, and that's why there was money left in supplies.
So I think that's why there's money left in. So back in March, I think we had expected. The numbers all look different, and it is very confusing because there's interplay of a lot of things. There's interplay of expenditure surplus, revenue shortfalls, and then budgeted fund balance that wasn't realized, right? So if you want the numbers to kind of add up, which, because I've had to do it like 14 times, so I totally understand the confusion. Basically, at the end of the day, on the expense side of the budget, food services had $500,000 left. $370,000 of that was this, and then there was a little bit in salaries and some other smaller surpluses. So on the revenue side, they were short $675,000, and they had $250,000 in budgeted fund balance that, of course, didn't result in any realized revenue, right? So they had 675 plus 250 is 925. And so that was the revenue deficit, and then 500,000 of that was offset by their budget side surplus. So they had a net deficit of 425. So I could have just given them 425, and then they wouldn't have had a hit to their fund balance. But because I was nervous about this year, I gave them the full 675 because it made sense to do so, and we had the capacity to do so. And so that's why at the end of the day, they actually had an increase in their fund balance. Does that make sense?
Completely makes sense. Thank you so much for walking me that again.
But it's like all of those things together just are very hard to follow. So I totally get that.
Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Yeah, of course. Anything else on this stuff?
I don't see any other hands.
Okay. So moving into the fund balance. So thank you, Emily, for that question, really, because it will make this clearer. So at the end of the day, we had 1.8 million, on the expenditure side in surplus and $1 million in shortfall. As I said, $1 million of that shortfall, a lot of that is budgeted fund balance. But at the end of the day, we had a net increase to our fund balance of, 1.8 million minus $1 million. So a shortfall of $1 million in revenue, offset and then some by $1.8 million on the expenditure side that was unspent. So that's really 785,000. I'm rounding. So of that, 445,000 was an increase to the general fund balance, 250 in food services, and 90 or so in adult ed. So that's the increase that we're seeing as a result of the year-end results for FY20. The rest of this slide is about, okay, what does that mean? What are our fund balances now? So the table on the right adds it all up. The general fund balance is 4.8 million now. That's taking this increase into account. So I've added all those increases in. So these are FY20 year-end fund balances. Again, estimated pre-audit fund balances, but that's where we're at this point, 4.8 million. So what the state considers to be unassigned fund balance is that amount minus the amount budgeted for the next fiscal year. So the amount we have budgeted for fund balance usage in FY21. So that leaves us with an unassigned fund balance in the state's eyes of 4.3 million, which is over that 3% cap that we've discussed in the past. That cap only applies to the general fund. And that puts us about $1 million over that cap. So that's money that, we need to actually make a plan to work into our budget or expend over the next 3 years as per the state statute. Food services, we have 1.1 million, taking that extra 250 into account. And adult ed, we're at 220,000. And then we have these other pots of money. 3.1 million in capital reserve, which we have spoken about previously, and 700,000 in a fund that you've probably not heard about before, but I've kind of loosely been considering part of our fund balance all along. I just never called it out explicitly, is $700,000 in a fund that previously is where Medicaid reimbursements were deposited and collected. So historically, that is not what we do with Medicaid reimbursements anymore. But this is like dating back to I don't know how long, but it's been there since at least 2014, 2015, and has just sort of been rolling over. So if we didn't need the revenue for whatever reason to balance the budget in previous years, it would just sit in that fund, which is awesome because it provides us with some flexibility. For all intents and purposes, it's a fund balance, but it's a little bit better than a fund balance because it's sort of managed as a grant, which I have to admit I'm still trying to work with the state to figure out exactly what the rules are, but I believe that we actually can utilize it for expenditures if we need to in a pinch. So it might be a resource that we can utilize this year, but there are restrictions on what we can spend in it. I just need to get clear on those details. I'd hope to be clearer coming into tonight, but getting an answer from the state on anything other than CRF is very hard these days, and even getting answers on CRF from the poor state at this point is, quite challenging. So I'm optimistic we'll be able to make use of it to help us meet some of the to help us match some of the continuation costs that we have in the latter half of the year. I just need to get clear on exactly what our restrictions are for that. So I see a hand raised. I'm just going to finish kind of my explanation of the table and then happy to take questions. But so adding up all of those balances brings us to a total of about $10 million. That's about 8.3% of our FY21 budget. And if you kind of pull out those two restricted different sort of fund balances that don't just live in our general, our like local funds across general food and adult ed, pull those out, we've got about 6.2 million, which is about 5.1% of the FY21 budget, just for perspective. Did I see a hand?
I think Emily's hand was up.
Emily?
There it
Yeah,
is.
go ahead, Emily.
And now it's not.
Back down. Okay, so I don't see.
My hand's up. I just
Okay.
took it down and started talking, but did not take my.
Yep.
And my internet is going in and out, so I apologize. Can you hear me though?
We can now, but we did not hear your question.
Okay, I'm going to turn my video off because my internet is not stable right now. I apologize. I had a couple questions. One is the 1 million over the 3% cap. Are there limitations? And I'm sorry again if this is not a question I should know the answer to, but are there limitations on how we spend that?
Not how in terms of use. There's limitations in terms of like process and how and when. I guess when. You know, and I'm going to talk about that in the next slide. But in terms of like what we use it for, is there's no explicit restriction. What we're supposed to do is just come up with a plan to utilize it. So in the past, when we've been over the cap, the funds were transferred to the capital reserve. That's how the capital reserve exists. That's how and why the capital reserve came to be. As there was, I believe, excess over 3%. That's at least what the council order says. And so they transferred some funds into the capital reserve. We have the option of, you know, budgeting it, but we have to be careful about that because once you budget it and then you spend it, it's gone, and you have to then fill the gap in a future year, right? But in a really tough year, which is probably what we're looking at, you know, I expect that's what we'll probably do with it. But we budget it for whatever, you know. It's just a revenue source for funding our budget, so.
And then the food services balance, I just heard your explanation of looking ahead to this year and this year being challenging as well. It still seems like a lot of money. Can you just help me understand the size of that? And yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I could pull up the food services budget. It's a much higher percentage of the food services budget than the general fund balances of the general fund balance, in part because the general fund balance is capped. But if you think about it, we had a $675,000 deficit this year in federal funding and federal, you know, reimbursements and paid meals. Now, this is a super weird year, but it was 800 and it was 850 before. So if it had actually hit that, it would have been down, you know, way down, you know, $200,000 or something. So I think that because food services relies so much on it's entirely non-tax funded, unlike the general fund, which is almost entirely taxes. It is the most subject and most likely to, you know, face a revenue shortfall in any given year. So I personally believe that's why the food services fund balance should be a much higher percentage of their budget, if that makes sense.
And if you look on the memo, you can see the mix of local and other funds in the food service. It's the last page of the memo.
Yeah, just a much more diverse funding mix, and it doesn't have this, you know, stability of property taxes like the rest of the budget does. So was that all, Emily? I don't know if we lost her. Okay, so I will move on to the next slide unless anybody else has any. The next slide is continuing in this topic. So as I mentioned, so our fund balance all added up, including the capital reserve and the Medicaid, is about 8.3% of the budget. Now, I was like really weirded out and surprised when it came out to exactly 8.3%, because 8.3% is a meaningful number. And it's just super weird and coincidental that it did come out. It's just random that it came out to that, but 8.3% is exactly 1 month of expenses. It's 1/12. And in the city's fund balance policy, it's the exact amount that the city says is cause for concern to go beneath, right? So, I wanted to give some context on, what is a normal fund balance, right? So the state caps it at 3% for some unknown reason. That seems really small to me. But, the city of Portland has a position on what an appropriate fund balance is for them. I will just read it. It's a goal of the city to achieve and maintain an unassigned general fund balance of 12.5% of expenditures. The city considers a balance of less than 8.3% to be cause for concern, and they'll work to restore a balance, less than that as soon as possible. So, and when the city's talking about this, they're talking about unassigned. I don't believe they're talking about a capital reserve or, this Medicaid kind of grant balance we have. They're really talking about the number that to us corresponds to that, 5.1% at the bottom. So I guess my point is you can look at 10 million in that chart and think that's like a lot of money, but it really isn't. It's really an appropriate, maybe even a small by these standards, fund balance for the size of our budget. So I just couldn't believe it came out to 8.3%. That was super weird. But again, it's like total coincidence. That was not by design. But it was interesting and it made it easy to illustrate this point. So, just so we understand, what, our options are here. So as I said, it's not a massive amount of money that we should just go out and blow by any stretch. But to the extent we want to consider, obviously in these extraordinary times, to the extent we do wish to consider expending it, there's processes that are different for each of these. So for the general fund, food services, adult ed, things that are considered our local fund. In general, our fund balance is utilized when at year end expenditures exceed collected revenue. So expenditures, we actually added to our fund balance this year. Last year, we hit the fund balance by a few $100,000. I don't remember exactly how much, but that just sort of happens by default when we have more expenditures than we have revenue. Additionally, we budget it in our budget during our budget process each year. The more we budget, the more likely we're going to hit it at year end, right? So, if we budget $500,000 in fund balance, and then we have $500,000 left over on the expense side and surplus at the end of the year, and our revenue targets are on point, we're not going to spend any fund balance, right? So like in an ideal world, year over year, we'd budget the exact amount of fund balance that we expect to have sort of as expenditure surplus, that we need to, manage our budget over the course of the year, and we keep our fund balance stable. Obviously it's not that simple, but so basically that's how we normally use it. We can budget in order to budget additional fund balance, outside of the budget process, we would still have to get council approval and voter, and we'd have to go to referendum. So, in order to increase our budget, whether it's, requesting additional, unless it's EPS, because there's a provision in our budget articles about additional EPS coming, that we actually don't have to go back out to vote unless it's EPS. We have to go through the same kind of process that we would, or same kind of process as we would for our normal budget process if we want to increase our budget. So, it's not like we can just say, let's use the $1 million in FY21. It's something that we could consider in a bind, but would require this process, right? Capital reserve, we could utilize for, capital projects. I think the general premise of a capital reserve is to, have the funds on hand in an emergency if the boiler breaks or, big expenses like that obviously you can't in any normal budget year just fit into your budget. That's really what it exists for. But to the extent we wanted to utilize it for, anything that, falls under kind of that general area of capital improvements, we do not need to go out to referendum for. I believe back when the Capital Reserve Fund was established, there was a vote, and that satisfies that requirement. So to use the capital reserve, we would just need to work with the city and go to the council to get approval to utilize those funds. And as I mentioned, I'm still kind of trying to work through with the state what exactly the restrictions are on this Medicaid grant that I have this balance sitting in, to see if it's something where we can actually alleviate some expense side strain this year. And I will absolutely get back to you guys on that. And that'll be part of the discussion of potential funding sources for this year, and meeting, trying to meet the continuation costs we have after the CRF grant ends. So I think that's all I've got for fund balances. So happy to answer any questions.
Can I just, before questions, just remind the board that the reason that Miranda did this deep dive into the fund balances was at our last meeting, we had this discussion about how, what are the potential sources for continuing some of the investments that we've made with the CRF funds. And it was in that context that this was raised. So just to sort of tie that last comment that Miranda had to the context of the last meeting.
Emily?
And I think it was my question at the last meeting, so thank you so much. This has been incredibly helpful. The last slide where you break it out, in particular for me, it was very helpful in just providing that kind of top-level clarity, so thank you. Mm-hmm. My question is with respect to the capital reserve. So just so I understand what I thought, my previous understanding of this is essentially fund balance over the 3% that has rolled over. But so my question, is that correct?
It was converted by council order to a capital reserve fund, at which time it has restrictions, but also no longer counts towards our 3% cap. In terms of how the state views it. So we don't have to spend it tomorrow. We don't have to reduce the balance, but we can only utilize it for that restricted purpose of capital improvements.
Okay.
Does that answer I'm sorry if that made it more confusing.
No, that was my understanding. It just seems challenging in that we now are limited in how we could spend that. For instance, not being able to spend it on staffing. It seems like an unfortunate endpoint for what had been general fund money. But Javier's raising his hand. Maybe I'm saying that.
Yeah, I'm sort of questioning along the same line. Was that a one-time action, or is that what happens to all fund balance over the 3.5 or the 3%?
It's one of the things you can do when you have fund balance in excess of the cap. So it no longer counts toward the cap when you do it. The state has two, I think, statutorily acceptable. There might be more because there was a new policy that came out this year actually, but it maybe only applied to RSUs, and I never actually got an answer from Drummond Woodsum as to whether it pertained to municipal school districts. But prior to that, you could only establish a special education reserve or a capital reserve. Otherwise, it's considered this pool of unassigned fund balance that counts towards a 3% cap. So we never set up a special ed reserve, probably in part because if you expend from that reserve, those special education expenditures no longer count toward GPS. So I think Drummond Woodsum often actually advises against doing that. We set up the capital reserve instead. I don't know why. I mean, it was back in 2016, I think.
Yeah, think I'm having memories of this, and I think we ended up getting more state allocation than had been approved in the budget. So we had to figure out what to do with it, and it was significant. It was like, I don't know, a few $1 million. But the discussion we had at the time is, if we put it into the operating budget, then, you know, it increases our budget. How do we come up with that money next year? You know, it's like if you inherited money in your own budget, but that's not money that you earn every year, you know, you don't then go and increase your expenses based on that. So that was kind of the philosophy, I think, behind setting up a capital reserve.
Yeah, and if you didn't have one at all at the time, I think it totally makes sense to have it. It's scary not to have it, really, because, you know, something could go at any point in time, and capital type things are expensive, so you can't just absorb them. And you know, I totally agree with what you're saying. You maybe you could have increased the budget at the time for the 3-year period. They allow you to like enact a plan, but again, you have to meet that gap at the end. It goes away. It's one-time funds. It's not, you know, annual income, as you aptly pointed out. So, you know, there's a decision made at the time by the folks, you know, involved at the time. So,
and then how does it work? Can you only spend it for capital projects?
Yes, but the council order that I have is broad. It actually said it was going to be utilized to kind of offset. I think we can offset. I believe you can use it to offset new debt, right? So we could work with the city potentially to put those funds into use against CIP projects we already have, so we don't have new borrowing. That, when I read the council order, it sounds like what was intended. The funds are still here. And I asked Brendan, you know, is it possible these were actually used and it wasn't accounted for? Did it offset our debt? And, you know, he did not indicate that it was. I mean, I've asked several times, but you would think it needs to still have additional council action to be used. So I don't know how it would have. I don't know why it was never utilized. I just don't know, but that's what the council order. I'm happy to share the council order. I mean, I have it, but that was what it was. It was basically just stated. It was very, very broad. I've sent it to the lawyers and asked them, you know, what does this mean, you know, now for us years later? And he says, really, it's just a matter of working with the city to get a use approved that is broadly within the scope of a capital improvement, right? So I think it's pretty broad in terms of what's actually formal in terms of action related to this.
So how would you, I mean, there's a couple of things here, right? Like if we are thinking about it in a traditional capital improvement kind of framework, you know, one, could we, in addition to CIP, could we use it to offset BFOF debt that we know is going to be increasing in the coming years, this year? Actually, maybe. So I know it's all been deferred a little bit, but very soon. And then two, like, would you recommend, we have deferred maintenance at, you know, many of the schools. Would you recommend putting in place, I mean, this is clearly, you know, maybe absent the pandemic, when there's, you know, there's probably not bandwidth to do this, but absent the pandemic, would you recommend putting into place a kind of plan to do some of the deferred maintenance to spend this down some?
I mean, it certainly seems like something that, I mean, I don't know, Javier, you're shaking your head, so I don't know if you have a...
Yeah, I mean, no, I mean, I'm struggling with the, you know, it's not that much money. I mean, if a roof were to collapse, you know, that it would go, right? You know, so I think that's, you know, to do deferred, you know, maintenance is, you know, that's hard to sort of understand what that would that wouldn't pay for our deferred maintenance, and then we wouldn't have a fund to be able to draw on if a roof collapses.
Yeah, fair enough. And on the BFOF,
I think that it's a bigger conversation that needs to be had as part of the budget process for FY22, and we really need to connect with the city on this. I'll be honest, like the CIP debt service BFOF side of the budget is not somewhere that I feel I have full understanding or visibility like I'd like to, mainly just because we just haven't sat down and hashed out all the details. I don't have the exact, I receive the debt service amounts from the city. It's not something that we discuss and strategize together on, or haven't so far, right? So, and that's just, it just hasn't happened. So, and that's certainly not criticizing the city side. It just hasn't happened. So, but I think it should, for sure. In the lead up to FY22 for a variety of reasons, among them this reason, and potential options for some savings moving forward into tough budget years. So,
Brenda, thank you so much. This has been really illuminating to me. So I appreciate the time to go through this.
Thank you for asking the question, because this isn't something we've really, touched on before. So it was good to do so, I think. Anything else on this? Before we kind of shift gears, the next topic is moving into CRF, so kind of different stuff.
I don't see any other hands.
Okay. All right, so back to CRF. It was nice to talk about something else, actually. Like, oh God, here we are again. Not that I'm not delighted by the CRF. I mean, it's great. It's a lot of money, but anyway, it's just a lot. So here's a summary of kind of all the different pots of CRF funding that we've got actually at this point, which is a bit different probably than we last discussed. We've got CRF, which we're now calling the CRF round one. So the initial installment of coronavirus relief funding that we got from the state, 6.2 million. That is kind of officially in the books in terms of our proposal. We've gone back and forth with the state a few times on it, and it's now, it's final as of this week. CRF round two is actually slightly more, 6.5 million. And then we still, of course, have the CRF day programming. That was a competitive grant, and that was 1.1 million. And then CRF adult education, which was also approved this past week, and then moving forward on that is another 210,000. So all told, it's actually $14 million, all of which has to be spent by December 30th. So just, this is a review. We've discussed CRF round one a few times, but just to remind you of what was in there, none of this should be too surprising. We've moved some things around, moved some things kind of in and out in terms of what we were going to do in round one versus round two, just based on discussions with the state, a few open questions. But where we landed, is pretty much as you would expect. Technology, staffing, which we've discussed at great length, facilities improvements that you all know about. Certainly we can talk more about this, but I think we've pretty much covered it already. And then we did move forward with a bus purchase. And we did that when we did that with the knowledge that we were getting CRF2, and ultimately I ended up putting it in CRF1 because I had to take some things out of CRF1 that the state didn't approve, that we're in discussions with them about and are hoping we can put into CRF2. So it was really just kind of some reshuffling there. So that's pretty much, that's round one. Is there any questions on round one at this point? Because I think the bulk of the discussion will be about round two. Okay. So, CRF round two, it's $6.5 million to be spent in the course of 3 months. And we, already received $6.2 million, right? So it's a lot. So I guess I just want to make the point here that with this second round of funding, the dollar amount of the grant is no longer our constraint. Our constraints are really the following: the allowability and permissibility on the grant for the stuff we would like to do. So just kind of summary bullets of the constraints we're working, or restrictions we're working within, are that, in principle, this grant has been made to reopen school. So everything that we put in here has to be necessary and reasonable in order to reopen school safely. So just an example, we had budgeted in CRF1 the cost of, is it PSATs? SATs?
The SAT and the PSAT.
Okay, so usually state-sponsored testing that was canceled, and so now we are paying for it to be able to offer it to students. That's a COVID-related expense, but the state, interpreted as not being critical to reopening school safely. So even though it's an extra expense that's COVID-related, they didn't approve it. I mean, it's $15,000. It's not a massive expense, but that's just an example of, it's not within the scope. So it's just one example of things that, kind of you'd think would fall in this, and then actually at the end of the day, they don't. So, so necessary and reasonable in order to reopen schools safely. It has to be an extra cost explicitly caused by the pandemic. It has to be otherwise unbudgeted, so it can't supplant or replace anything that we actually already budgeted. And, the big one, obviously, it has to be paid for and received by December 30th. And as I've mentioned in the past, this is actually more restrictive than most grants. You would think that, you could pay. So we actually have a paycheck on December 31st. All of that work that staff did, that they will be paid for on December 31st, is within the grant period, but the funds aren't going to be liquidated in time. So, it actually crossed my mind, do we change the pay date? I don't even know if that's something that I can just do, but I'm going to consider it. But that might actually allow us to include it, but that's what we're talking about. It has to be both, not just the services rendered within, it has to be liquidated by the 30th. So it's tough. And then finally, thorn in everyone's side recently is that they're requiring proration on any annual license. So a lot of software purchases, almost all of our software purchases are annual, and initially we believed that we were going to be able to cover the entire cost on the grant, because that's the way subscriptions work. We don't have an option to just buy 3 months. But they've determined that, any annual cost for a service, including software subscriptions, has to be prorated. So if the subscription started in September and it runs through August, we can charge 4 out of 12 months, so a third only. And that's problematic because we're stuck with that remaining expense, just like we are with, staffing, which is of course a much bigger dollar amount. But these things all add up. So, what was easy to... What's that?
It's harder than staffing, because in staffing you can do furloughs and things along those lines. But once you actually have the software, there's no walking it back. Right.
I mean, it's just lower dollar amount, but yeah, it's true. We're kind of stuck with it once we have it. And it doesn't help that they actually told us previously that they would fund it. So some things we've already purchased, and that's that. That's not a massive amount. I don't want you to think that is a massive amount, but it's frustrating. It's not. The state's doing the best they can. They're just trying to interpret the guidelines, and nobody, there's just a lack of clarity across the board. But it's a real challenge. It's quite frankly scary to have this much money to spend and be concerned, that somehow after the fact there's going to be some statement of, oh, that's not actually allowable when I go to bill it. So it's like a double-edged sword. And then of course, outside of that, it's just so many decisions. Like we were just talking about the software and staffing. I mean, a lot of the stuff we need has enduring costs, right? And do these things even make sense to do for just a month or two? We've kind of done a lot of the things that didn't have enduring costs already, which is mostly the tech and facilities stuff, buses and, that kind of thing. So, that's just, continuing to be an issue. And then finally, just our capacity to, anything we do, we have to ensure we actually have the capacity to implement and enact in the next few months. So these are really what I consider the constraints. I don't want to worry too much about the dollar amount of this budget, of this grant. It's not about cost at this point. It's about these things. So the last slide here is really just for us to kind of discuss what we're thinking about putting in the grant, how much we think we're going to put in the grant, and just have a discussion on strategy related to it. So, another challenge, which I actually should have put in the previous slide, is, the proposal is due next Thursday, which is, very soon. So it's a quick turnaround. And I still have not managed to get a clear answer on whether or not we're going to have an opportunity to amend it after that. I suspect we will, but it has not been stated. And I don't know, Javier, if you know anything.
No, I don't, but I just can't imagine that you'd be locked into something, with 2 weeks notice, and then expect that it's going to, not change at all. So.
Yeah. And so some things we're trying to put in there, which I didn't mention in the FY20 discussion, but I think I put in the memo. Now that we have extra money, we previously these grants technically start in March, so I can allocate costs to these grants retroactively, and I was not actually planning to do that in FY20 because I didn't need to at the end of the day, and the funds were better spent on new items necessary in FY21. But now that we have the additional funding, to the extent I can identify some of those COVID explicit unbudgeted extra costs from last year, I intend to allocate them, and I'll have to do so pretty soon to fit it in within our audit. I don't think it's a massive amount of money, a couple $100,000, because I cannot, unfortunately, utilize it to offset our revenue deficits, which was the bigger impact really of COVID last year. But we do have some costs to allocate, so we'll do that. The child care day programming grant that I submitted, at the time, we expected the full day programming only to go for the first month, but with the decision, recently to continue the hybrid in the elementary level, we will be continuing those contracts, and there's some expense related to that we can now build into CRF2. Additional PPE, additional supplies, some additional contractual support, directors and the cabinet and department heads are kind of all working, on considering what they might need that we might be able to put on the grant, working on proposals. So we're going to connect on that early next week. I assume we'll have more supplies and contractual support. And another area is kind of monitors and other just computer peripherals to help facilitate remote teaching. That was not something that was included before, but we're getting a lot of requests for that. So two things that are unknowns at this point that we've discussed are hazard pay. So hazard pay is definitely not allowed broadly, but it might be allowable just for specific groups that are most, specific roles that are most at risk and have most physical contact in the workplace. Initially, I was told it was not going to be approvable, and then they came back and said, let me bump this question up, and we'll see if, because you've only proposed it for a small subset of staff, perhaps it is allowable. So it's just one of those areas that's difficult, I think, for the state to determine whether or not the feds are going to think that's allowable. So I'm waiting on an answer from the state on that. And then finally, these warranties for our devices. So Apple Care for Mac devices, and then protection plans for our Chromebooks, that I had put into CRF1, and that was denied because it's considered a proratable multi-year service. And so that was a sizable amount of money, and it's frustrating that we're not able to include it because that potentially pigeonholes us into future costs to repair and replace these devices. So the state, there is some possibility, some glimmer of hope that the state's going to come back and offer some additional what they called administrative convenience, which could allow us to actually build some of these things in, but we're not banking on it or planning on it. We're just kind of awaiting word on whether or not that's possible. So if we are able to put that in, that's about 500,000, I think, in total. It's a lot. So we're, going to have to cancel the plans and not purchase the protection if we can't put it in. But if we do put it in, the estimates across all these bullets are still only about $2 million. So if we're not allowed to put those warranties or hazard pay in, that's going to be about $650 less than that. So we're really at this point with all these things nowhere near the $6.5 million that's been allocated. So I'll turn it over to Javier if he has any additional things to add on this, but some other considerations, as you guys know, is potentially figuring out a way to support families. Just kind of generally, we haven't made too much progress in terms of figuring out a way to get that in there between now and next week. So I don't know if you have anything to add on that, Javier. You're muted.
That's the only thing that we have been able to think about is there a way to use the remaining money to do some form of payments to family to sort of offset their childcare costs or things along those lines that could be, one-time payments that would be COVID related, so it would be, in order for people to be able to, to put their children in childcare, to hire care on those remote days and things along those lines, as one of the options for spending on that money. I shared with you over the weekend the article from the 74 million that talked about the National Parents Union and some of the creative sort of micro-schooling ideas that they seeded with some funding. And I think, that type of a thing is what we could potentially look to do, or some form of just a payment that would be for a certain amount to families that were eligible based on some form of evidence that they had those expenses that they had to incur. So I think that's really all that we have been able to come up with. As Miranda mentioned, there are all these, there's these, small things that people might need, but, they all don't amount to a whole lot of money. And so that's the only other option that we can think of at this point.
Yeah, and I would just add that, these things are going to come into play with that. I don't know if the state is going to find that to be necessary and reasonable in order to open schools safely. And I don't know that we have the capacity to implement such a program. It would depend on how we've designed the program. So I think coming back to that, certainly great thoughts and ideas, but I have some concerns on the feasibility of moving forward with that as well. So, and that's all I've got here. So.
Emily?
Yeah, I'm mostly wondering if, this is just, it's such a hard situation when we face, a potentially devastating budget next year, but right now have money that we can't spend, right? So, which clearly I'm articulating just the very basics of the situation, but
I think Emily froze.
Sorry. Has there been any effort to, across, whether from Portland or beyond, to reach out to the federal delegation and given that they have failed to pass any additional coronavirus relief funding, to push to get the December 30th deadline extended?
Yeah, MSMA has. So it is very much on the radar for, for our delegation, including Senator Collins. But, it's not, it's not just something that they can snap their fingers and make happen. So, but. And the interesting thing about it is that it's not something that across the board is. It's not like every state is facing this challenge. I think this is this is just. I don't want to say just because I'm very grateful for it, but it's an outgrowth of the way that Maine decided to dedicate these $350 million to schools. And, in other places, they've used it for other things, and they might have had more success in being able to spend it on those other things. So it's not like every state, where every state was very much united around the extension of the food, the summer feeding grants. There isn't that same, level of intensity across the country for the extension of these funds.
I guess I disagree, because I hear you that other states have spent the money differently, and that we are in a very fortunate place that we're even, we're grappling with how to spend this money. But other states are facing the challenge of being in the middle of a pandemic that has no end in sight, with the federal government failing to provide relief funds to cities and states and American families, and on and on. I
didn't suggest that.
I just think the idea that the use of the funds, the deadline for the use of the funds from the initial federal law could be changed seems very plausible to me, and not a heavy lift. And it's like 3 weeks before the election. So I don't know. I guess I'd be interested in continuing to raise this with Senator Collins and the rest of the delegation, and trying to find additional ways to the extent that they're failing to provide additional relief in the midst of the pandemic. This seems very common sense. Extend the deadline for the funds already allocated.
I agree with that sentiment, Emily. I think, like you said, it's very common sense. This is maybe not all states are dealing with this, but we're certainly not alone in this issue, in this problem. And, depending on what happens after the election, I think if we can just, assuming that we end up with a different administration, if there were a way that we could get this sort of like right on the priority agenda, I feel like it would be an easy decision. So I kind of echo that sentiment of just kind of really trying to maintain this on the radar of our federal delegation. And then the other sort of just question I wanted to probe was the criteria. So it sounds like, the problem that we're facing is the interpretation by the state of the federal rules. And so what I'm wondering is, are we confident that the state is right in their interpretation? And is there anything would there be any benefit to kind of getting our legal team involved in interpreting that?
The interpretation of what?
So, I mean, these are federal funds and it's federal criteria that's set, right? But the state is the ones kind of telling us, yes, that'll get approved, or no, that won't get approved, right? So I guess the question is, do we agree with the state's interpretation of the federal provisions? So, if I forget exactly what the language was, but it seemed pretty broad that, it has to be a necessary, so do we agree with the state's interpretation of necessary? I understand.
The only places where we've disagreed, I guess, is, around those items that Miranda mentioned. And, again, we met with the DOE this week and, had some positive outcome, from that meeting. Not everything that we wanted, but, there's still hope that we will be able to get the service plans approved. And so otherwise, I think, we decided not to debate the $15,000 for the SAT because it just seemed like, not worth it to fight over the $15,000. But otherwise, we've not really been rejected on any front. I think the fundamental problem is, the biggest problem, I don't know, it's the fundamental problem. The biggest problem is the fact that, these funds run out on December 30th. And I don't think that is a matter of interpretation.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And also just to, we like Javier said, we had a really actually very productive conversation, I felt, with the state. They had actually originally rejected the Google Suite one-time kind of access fee from the application, but when we discussed it and explained how it works and that there is no end date and we really can't use the devices effectively without it, they changed their mind and they let us put it in, right? So that was the purpose of the discussion, was to make sure we were all on the same page in terms of understanding where they were coming from with their decision and why we disagreed. And ultimately the warranties are that's semi-subjective, but the fact that the proration of software is very hard to argue. They're not wrong, that it's continuing beyond the end date of the grant. So I can understand where they're coming from, and they might be being cautious. And the way it was described to us was from their perspective, if things go south and are unallowable at the local level, ultimately, at the end of the day, the state's on the hook, so they have to be cautious. And I understand that as well. They have to be cautious, because they're on the line with these funds as well. So I appreciated that comment and understood that. So I think, but like Javier said, there wasn't a ton that we sort of differed on.
They were also at the time, and that was very problematic, questioning the purchase of 6,500 devices. So basically, they said, "You have devices. How come you're?" And so we made the case as to why we needed to refresh our entire inventory, and in the end, they accepted that. So I was, that to me was the big one, because that was $2 million. So.
But we did actually.
I don't know. I think we are not bashful about pushing back on these things. I think we will continue to do that. But I don't think that the fundamental, sort of December 30th thing is something that is subjective that anybody at Drummond Woodson could change.
No. Yeah. Yeah, some of the costs that we have to incur to open up are fundamental shifts in the way that we operate. And I think that's frustratingly the crux of how this funding doesn't fit our practical operations.
I mean, I think that the notion that it's, to reopen as opposed to reopen and stay open,
Right.
which is, I think, what is, frustrating, on the staff front. Again, we're looking at $2 million of costs for the second half of the year that we don't have budgeted, and we don't have, we can't take $2 million from that $6.5 million and say we're going to put it over here to pay for those salaries in the second half of the year. Those salaries were necessary to open school because of the way that we're opening school. But if we don't change the way we're opening school, we still have those costs. And, so it's like we can do it to open school, but then we have to close school because we can't do the same things that we did to open it. So that's just, it's like one of the things that just feels insane about all of this.
So I appreciate all of your work on this. It's insane, like you said, insane. I wish I had, better suggestions, but I think you're doing everything you can, clearly, and working really hard on it. So that's very much appreciated.
Thanks. And then just on that point about sort of trying to find a way to get money out in payments to families, I just want to make sure that the board is aware of that has the potential to be sort of first of all, we don't know that we can do it, but if we manage to do it, it is something that will get attention, probably media attention, probably lots of questions and potentially concerns from folks. So I just wanted to make sure that in a public setting, I brought that to your attention as something that we were going to be pursuing. And if you have any concerns about it, to sort of let you know now. That's why I sent the article over the weekend and mentioned that I would be talking about it at the meeting tonight.
Emily?
I am very, just state outright, I'm very supportive of trying to do that. I guess my only concern is just our staff capacity to make it happen. So I think it would be, given the December 30th deadline, I think it would be tremendous for us to actually help PPS families address the increased child care costs that all of us with elementary school kids are facing. And again, like I know, of course, based on need and all of that. So, I would like to be supportive in any way I can. I just do wonder, like, we're already shouldering so much. So that's my concern, would just be our capacity to make it happen from a staffing standpoint.
I agree with that. When I read the article, I think it's a really innovative way to look at it. So I support going forward with it and in the best way that you're able to. Any other? Emily's hand is, I don't know if it's still raised or raised again. Emily? Oh, it's down. Okay. Anyone else?
I will, since he popped on camera, I didn't know if he was there, we'll give credit to Board Member Burke for making the provocation and sort of helping us even think through some of that, looking at other places that have done that with CRF funds, not necessarily in the school context, but using CRF funds to make direct payments to families for COVID-related expenses. So we think that there's a precedent that we can, that we can sort of latch onto. And I do appreciate, Emily, your concern about the capacity, because I do think that I share that concern. So trying to think about how to do it as well as, what to do is part of the challenge for us.
Any last thoughts? Seeing none. I did want to give a quick shout out to, I know the announcement came out to everybody this week about Miranda's leaving, and I wanted to just note just how grateful this committee has been for your work in the last year. And I think you've just done a tremendous job in what I think is the most fundamental thing for finance directors in terms of their interaction with the board is to boil down information to lay people's terms. And I've really appreciated the way that you have been able to synthesize information for us and put all these presentations together, and just all of the hard work that you've done for us this year. So I just wanted to put that out there. I know you'll still be with us for a little while, but wanted to just say thank you from all of us. I know everybody shares the sentiment.
I just add something. Yeah. So yeah. I just to echo Anna, Miranda, you're incredible. I mean, not only in boiling information down and making it understandable to the board and the public, and really aiding in our stewardship of the budget, but also in I think understanding, seeing. I think you came and saw the budget with fresh eyes, and you figured things out that we didn't know, and so just really appreciating the everything that you've brought to it, and understanding what you've really put I think the district in a better place in terms of the responsibility that you've taken and the thoroughness that you've done in your job, as well as the way that you've enabled us to understand the budget and the challenges and the kind of situation we face going forward. We'll really miss you. I will.
Thank you both very much. I appreciate that.
I'll just say briefly, Miranda, you've been incredible, and this is something, and I have lots of feelings about it. And it's because you're so incredible. So thank you.
It's very kind of you to say thank you.
All right. Unless I see any last minute hands here, I'm not seeing any. I guess I'll close the meeting. Thank you, everyone, and good night.
Good night.
Thank you. Good night.